Ready to make a real impact every day? Join the Active Day Home Care team and help clients maintain their independence in the comfort of their own homes. Make a difference in someone's life as you provide essential daily assistance and protect their health and happiness. Earn up to $20 an hour and enjoy additional perks like optional daily pay, 401k, paid time off, ongoing educational training, and more. Join a team that values care, compassion, and your professional growth. Visit activeday.com to apply.
No fear of doom. We are American Freedom Radio. American Freedom Radio.
It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, proud investigator Ed Opperman, and every Saturday night you can find me here on American Freedom Radio. The show is brought to you by emailrevealer.com. Go to emailrevealer.com, and let's say you want to locate somebody, summer's coming, old romance or something like that. You can go there and we can do a locate for you, people search. You can do a background check on somebody, asset search. That's why you would go to emailrevealer.com. Hey, don't forget OppermanReport.com. We have a special members section, exclusive content that you won't find here on Friday nights or Saturday nights for free. It's exclusive content. You become a member and sign up. And we have extra shows you can find there on the OppermanReport.com. Also, too, we have just started a document section. By the way, there's a bookstore there, too, as well. But we've just started a document section where we add all kinds of nifty stuff. We have all kinds of stuff about the Trump lawsuits and Jeffrey Epstein. We just had last night Montgomery Blair Sibley, who's the attorney for the D.C. Madam, and we have you can go on there and find his exhibit that has all the Verizon telephone records of Jean Palfrey, the D.C. Madam. Today we have a very special guest. I'm really, really excited about this. Danny, have we been able to connect with our guest?
Yes.
Okay, great. We have Richard Stratton. This guy's the author of Smuggler's Blues, a true story of the Hippie Mafia. But also, too, I've been looking up his stuff. He also was one of the screenwriters of the movie White Boys, which is one of my favorite movies. And by coincidence, I just happened to be watching that movie earlier this week. I didn't even know that our guest was connected to that movie. Mr. Stratton, are you there?
I am indeed. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you pretty good.
Okay, great.
So, Mr. Stratton, tell us about yourself. Who is Richard Stratton?
Who is Richard Stratton? I ask myself that question every day.
Okay.
Just a guy trying to figure out what this fantastic experience we call life is really all about, and hoping that my time here on Earth will be useful and meaningful to other people after I have moved on.
Okay, very good.
That's who I am.
Let me ask you a question. How old are you?
I'm 70 years old.
70 years old. God bless you, man. Okay.
Yeah.
And you've had some life. You were the editor of High Times magazine. You were a marijuana, hashish smuggler, now a movie producer, all this kind of stuff. Looking back, you must be pretty impressed with yourself, right?
No, I wouldn't say so. In fact, I probably am harder on myself than I should be, but that's just part of my Yankee wasp upbringing, where you never really are satisfied or congratulate yourself. You more or less continually trying to improve your physical state, your mental state, your economic state. It's a drive that I have, so that I never really feel like, wow, I've really done this or done that. It's just like, okay, what's next?
Okay. Now, you grew up on the East Coast in New York?
I grew up in Boston, actually, well, in a suburb of Boston, Wellesley, Massachusetts, where the famous women's college is.
Oh, that must have been fun. Okay. So now, give us an idea. Smuggler's Blues, a true story of the Hippie Mafia. What's it about?
What's it about? It's about that era in the not-so-distant past when the United States was consuming upwards of 10 to 15, 20 tons of marijuana a day, and virtually none of it was being grown in this country. When all of it was being imported from Mexico and Colombia and Thailand, and hashish was coming in from Afghanistan and Lebanon and India and Pakistan, and guys like myself, people who were what we loosely referred to as the so-called Hippie Mafia, guys who were like guys and women, I shouldn't say just guys because there were quite a few women involved, who were the ones who were going to these countries and importing this cannabis product back into the United States and distributing it to the massive market that was then emerging in the United States. And in the interim, the homegrown network, the homegrown product has virtually taken over the marketplace, so that most of the marijuana that's consumed in America now is grown right here in America. But there was this period of time, the 60s, 70s, 80s, up until probably the late 80s, early 90s, when America really depended on these sort of hippie entrepreneurs who were willing to risk body and their freedom to keep America high. And that's basically what it's about. It was an adventurous time, a time of excitement and living outside the law. I think we realized then and knew then that this day would come eventually when the laws would change. We realized, I think, from an early point in the early 60s and certainly in 1974 when High Times was founded, we knew that ultimately this day would come when America would realize that this plant was not as dangerous and harmful as it has been made out to be, and ultimately be legal in this country. So I think we're on that, almost at that point now.
So back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you were one of the guys that was bringing in that commercial Colombian pot that was going for about $300, $350 a pound on the Northeast coast.
Yeah, that was one of the things I did.
Okay.
What my main area of expertise was Lebanese hashish, and that just happened by happenstance. I ended up in Beirut, started smuggling first suitcases with false bottoms full of hash back, and then ultimately we moved into what is known as the commercial smuggle, where you find a product that is in demand in the United States, a legal product that's in demand in the United States. You find a company that's in the process of importing that product. You make a deal and you hide your product in with the legal goods and hope that customs doesn't find it. And that's usually the way the big loads come in. And we were doing, sailboats, and we were doing freighters, and we were doing virtually, and people would come to me and say, I know somebody who has an airplane, or I know somebody who has a patch at the airport, the patch meaning a connection with the customs people or with the people who were working in the air freight terminal and could pull your product out before it went through customs. So we were always looking for ways to get cannabis products into the United States without getting busted.
Okay. Now, when you first made your connection in Afghanistan, or Lebanon, right? How old were you when you first made that connection over there?
I was probably 31, 32 at that point.
About 31 years old.
Early 30s, yeah. Because I went to prison when I was, how old was I? 37. Yeah, I was 37 when I got locked up. And got out when I was 45. So, yeah, it must have been probably my very first trip was late 20s, early 30s. But when I made the big connection, I connected with the guy who was the chief of customs in Lebanon, and that was my man. The big problem there was getting it out of the country. If you could get it safely out of the country, then of course there's always the issue of trying to get it in the country. But a lot of stuff, if you didn't have the right connection, not only in Lebanon, but in Mexico and Colombia and wherever these parts, you had to be paying the police. You had to be paying law enforcement, because it's all controlled by the cops in these countries. And once you had the right people, and you could pay the right people, and you knew you were going to get your product out, it was a lot easier to get it in.
Now, before you made your way to Lebanon, though, how did you get started? Like in high school, selling nickel bags and joints and stuff like that? How did you get started?
Well, I went to school in Arizona.
Okay.
From Wellesley to Arizona State University. I was a wrestler, and I was on the wrestling team at Arizona State. And I had a roommate who was older, who was a graduate student who smoked pot and who had a truck. And we used to take these trips to the different places around the state of Arizona. And then we started taking these longer trips down to Baja California and down into Mexico, camping and just going around and checking it out. And at one point, we were on our way back, and we stopped at this border town, Nogales, and my friend went off to check out the girls in this establishment that we were in. And I asked the bartender if there was any pot available. And he brought his 9 or 10-year-old son over and said, in Spanish, take this guy and introduce him to Pepe and get him some mota, some marijuana. So he took me around the corner to a place where they fixed these flat tires. And there was a guy there who was like a rumpled version of Humphrey Bogart. He was a Mexican dude who he said, well, I don't sell joints. I only sell kilos. And he was selling kilos for $100 a kilo. I had $300 on me. I bought 3 kilos. I hid it behind the door panel of this international pickup truck that my roommate was driving. When he came down, he was too wasted to drive. He was half drunk and was basically falling asleep. So I ended up driving the truck back across the border, knowing that there was 3 kilos hidden in the door. And that rush that I got, that adrenaline rush that I got, became my drug of choice. You know, it was that whole thing of just getting off on the energy involved in it. Like I used to tell people, it's like gambling. You know, it's like you risk your money, you risk your life, you risk your freedom, but the reward and the adrenaline rush that you get from it is ultimately what keeps you wired to the enterprise.
The money's good too, though.
The money is good too. Yeah, the money was insane. The money was crazy.
Now, if you got these kilos for $100 a key down in Nogales, then where'd you sell it? In Tucson?
No, I took it back to Boston.
All the way back to Boston. How'd you get it back to Boston? On a plane?
On a plane. In those days, it was like 1964. There
Right.
was no dogs at the airport. There was no checkpoints. I mean, I look at the news now and see these people standing 3 or 4 hours and 5 hours in line to get onto an airplane. In those days, you used to walk right in, check your bag, get on the plane, and you were there. So it's unbelievable how things have changed in the United States. But I took it back to Boston, broke it up, and my friends sold ounces, and made about $1,500, which in 1964 for a 19-year-old kid was a lot of money. And based on that, I ended up quitting school. Left. Instead of going back to college, I went to Europe and then took what they call like the hippie highway through Nepal and India and Pakistan and Afghanistan, and ended up in basically in Lebanon, which is where I spent most of my time, because while I was there, I got very lucky and got hooked up with the guy who was the chief of customs, who became my big source over there.
Now, how'd you manage that? If you were like this hippie from, Boston and Arizona, and you show up in Lebanon, you don't know the language, how'd you meet the head of the customs?
Well, what happened was that I bought a sample, and I was looking to get a sailboat loaded up, and I went back to my hotel room, and lo and behold, these guys came knocking on my door at around 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and I knew as soon as I took one look at them, I thought, these guys are the cops. And indeed, they were the cops. And I thought, oh, this is great. I'm going to get arrested. And they said, well, we're going to take you to meet the judge. And I said, meet the judge? Like 9 or 10 o'clock at night, I'm going to go meet the judge? But we did. We went to the judge's home, and he served me coffee and baklava. And he said, I want to introduce you to this gentleman. He introduced me to Muhammad. I won't tell you his last name at this point, but he introduced me to Muhammad, and Muhammad turned out to be, as I said, the chief of customs in Lebanon. And we started doing air freight shipments from, I would say, we started basically with about 1,500 kilos at a time, 750 kilos at a time. And those air freight things were great because it would be in the country like 2 days later. You know, and the way you would do it was you'd find something that like machine parts or something that was being brought in from a part of the world that we would ship our hash to, and then repackage it so that it looked like it was jet airplane parts coming out of Tokyo to the United States, but really there was hash in there. And we did that for, I don't know, probably 2 or 3 years before we started doing these massive commercial smuggles. The biggest one I did out of there was 7.5 tons, 15,000 pounds of hash that we brought into Newark in a load of dates.
Okay. So now you start getting the stuff back to the United States. That's even the 1,500 kilos. That's a pretty good load. How'd you distribute it?
Well, I had friends who basically were the ones who sold it. We sold a lot of hash in Canada. There was one guy in particular up there because the Canadians have always had a big market for hashish. But you know what would happen is you get a load in, show samples to these dealers. There were always dealers from all the major parts of the country, and that was really what the Hippie Mafia was this connection of these loosely connected families of dealers and importers who knew each other or knew of someone who knew somebody. You know, so someone would come to town and show a sample of Lebanese hash, and they'd say, oh, this is great. I know somebody on the West Coast who's got Thai sticks. And it was this loosely associated group of mostly young, middle-class, entrepreneurial freaks, you know, potheads.
Yeah.
That was what the Hippie Mafia was.
Okay. I'm here. I'm about to make a confession. Okay. I grew up in New York City, Lower East Side. I was one of the yippies at 9 Bleecker Street down there right around this time. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I believe that I've seen your product.
I'm sure you have.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. It was, yeah, right. It was, the hash came in. It was like an oval. It was wrapped in a really tight in a piece of cloth. Mm-hmm. And then it was a stamp on it.
Canvas sacks, right, and there were stamps on it, and that was the way you told your product. In our product, we called it Flower of Lebanon, or we called it the Bekaa Valley Flower. We always put the word flower in it because the guy who sold most of it was a guy whose nickname was Flower, who lived in Toronto. He was probably the biggest hashish soft drug dealer in North America at that time. Guy named Robert Robotham, who was a dear friend of mine, and still is a dear friend of mine. Did a lot of time. He did like almost 14 years in Canada for hashish and marijuana over the years. But so we called it Flower of Bekaa. We called it, the Rose of Bekaa was another name. We would stamp on the sack. And mostly what we brought from Lebanon was the Lebanese have a different way of grading it. It's Zahara, which means 0, which is like the top. There's double Zahara, which is the dealer's choice. That's the very best. Then there's 0, then there's number 1, number 2, number 3. Now, once you get down to 2 and 3, you're dealing with more commercial loads. Most of the loads that I did were either Zahara or 1. Very rarely did we do anything lower than that. Just because, our goal was to bring in a really good product and sell it at a good price. The belief being that then you would have good karma and, the load would be sold and that you wouldn't get busted.
Right. And, less chance people can rat you out, too, as well, if they're happy with you. You're not screwing people, right?
Exactly.
Now, it is kind of messed up now, looking back, as you talk about this guy who did 14 years, man. How many people from back in those days, they used to hand out some really serious prison time to people back in those days.
I wouldn't even say back in those days.
Yeah.
Because actually, when I got sentenced in 1984, and I was sentenced originally to 25 years with no parole. But had I been sentenced 2 years later, I would have been sentenced to mandatory life without parole.
Wow.
And that was because of what they call the kingpin statute, which was put into effect as a continuing criminal enterprise. If you brought in more than 10 tons in any calendar year, which anybody who was in the business at the level that I was in, 10 tons, you bring in 10 tons in one trip, and you might do 3 or 4 or half a dozen trips a year. If you're bringing in a freighter full of Colombian pot, there'd be 30,000 pounds on there. There'd be 20, 30 tons sometimes of pot. So to become a kingpin was virtually easy, and to be then taken to court and charged under the kingpin statute, you were facing when I got sentenced, it was from 10 to life with no parole, anywhere in between. After 1986, they changed the law and made it mandatory life without parole. And in fact, recently there was a couple of Canadians who were smuggling pot in from Canada across the Mohawk Indian Reservation way up in the northern part of New York State. And they just got busted, and they got sentenced to mandatory life without parole. I'm now working with some lawyers who are trying to get them out and also get this law changed, because it's ridiculous. Here you have a product, a plant that is virtually legal in this country now, has been seen as having medicinal value for a variety of ailments that people suffer from. It's a remarkable plant. No one's ever died from overdosing on marijuana or anything close to that. In fact, it's just the opposite. So this is a plant that has medicinal value, that has been recognized as a medicine in many states. It's legal now in California. It's legal in Colorado and in Washington State for recreational purposes. And those states are making massive amounts on taxing this plant. And then meanwhile, we're putting people in prison for life with no possibility of parole. It's all wrong. And one of the things that I'm most involved in now is trying to get these federal laws changed, because the states have changed their laws, but the feds they hate to admit that they've made a mistake, and that they're going to say, well, all those people that we've been locking up all these years for this plant that we suddenly have realized is not so bad after all. They don't want to admit that they made this massive mistake, and they've been locking people up for 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, just a couple of years ago, Dana Beal got arrested. And I think he was at some kind of legal conference, too, in a state where it was legal. And, they caught him at a couple 100 pounds or whatever, and he was in jail for a few years. Are you familiar with that story?
Yeah, no, and Dana's a friend of mine. I know Dana. I see him all the time. It's a shame, I'm telling you.
Yeah, because he's your age, too.
He's out now.
Yeah.
He's on the loose. These two guys, man, up there in Canada, they're in the U.S. federal prison, and when they say life with no parole, they mean you're never going home. You're going out in a box for marijuana. It's ridiculous. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it really is horrific.
Bad state of affairs.
Let's go back, though, to the 70s and the 80s. Now, you had this great connection going on with the Lebanese hash, bringing it in. Kept a lot of people employed. Okay, a lot of people were very happy. But now, how did you make the connection in Colombia at the same time? It's a total opposite end of the planet.
Well, when you're in that business and you have connections with people who are dealing, there was a lot of cocaine that was coming in at that time too,
right.
Which I was never dealing in cocaine, never had anything to do with cocaine. I saw it as a really kind of a destructive drug that was causing more trouble and more violence. But a lot of the Colombians that were dealing in coke were also bringing in shipments of pot. So, but the other thing that I did was that I had a lot of these fishermen and guys who owned boats up and down the east coast of the United States, in Maine, where I lived, and in Massachusetts, where I had homes. So if somebody would come to me and say, listen, we got a freighter that's coming up from Colombia, and we need someone to offload the mothership, I was able to put those kinds of things together. It might take me a month or two, but I had the connections to be able to get the fishermen to go out and offload the mothership and bring the load in. And for that, I would either get paid $5 a pound or I would get a percentage of the load. Usually I would get a percentage of the load. You know, and there, we had a big airstrip up in Maine where we would land airplanes up there, and it either would be my load or it would be someone else using the strip, and then I would get a percentage of that. So it was all done through this, as I say, this work of people who were in the cannabis business, in the marijuana or hashish business, and who knew me or knew someone that I knew who knew someone that I knew. You know what I mean? So it all came about through your associations and your relationships. If you had a good reputation, if you were known as someone who was honorable and who would take a load and then pay for it within a certain amount of time and not rip it off, you know, that's how you ended up doing business. A lot of these people who were in the so-called hippie mafia were also dealing in psychedelics. And in LSD, there was the whole Brotherhood of Eternal Love group that was out of Laguna Beach, California, who were manufacturing LSD and Orange Sunshine, and Wellesley and our whole crew out there who I was very close to all those people in California. Then there was another group out of Texas who were doing, we had a place in Texas where we used to smuggle weed in from Mexico and from Colombia in through Texas. So it was this loose-knit network of dealers and smugglers that worked together and mostly knew each other or knew of somebody who knew someone else who, I mean, then there was a whole group of Canadians, too. There was a bunch out in the West Coast who were bringing in massive loads of Thai sticks and pot from Thailand and from Vietnam. So that's how we ended up branching out into all different areas of the cannabis industry.
Now, you mentioned how you're still good friends with Dana. We just had recently A.J. Weberman's been on the show. I'm curious, though, if you knew a friend of mine, Fred Got Better?
Doesn't ring any bells.
No?
New Yorker?
Yeah, New York. Yeah, he hung out the 9 Bleecker Street and 10 Bleecker Street, Studio 10. Right around that time.
No, doesn't ring any bells.
He knew your product. He knew your stuff very well.
I'm sure everybody knew our product.
Yeah, and the prices back then that you guys were supplying were ridiculously cheap.
Yeah, it was, and that was the idea, was to bring it in at a good price and a good product, and then it would move really fast. You know, unfortunately, what happened was that a lot of greedy people got involved, and then they were bringing these massive loads of, whether it was commercial pot or commercial hash, and that would glut the market. And it happened time after time. So we bring in a load of really good hash, and then we go to our dealers, and the dealers would come back and say, well, we got a problem because the market's flooded with this low-grade Lebanese hashish, and it's not moving. So then that was actually how High Times got started, because it was at a time when people really didn't know what Colombian gold pot was.
Right.
They were looking for a way to advertise it. And Tom Prasad and some people came up with this idea of, well, why don't we start a magazine and put a centerfold in there, and whatever the product is that we're trying to get to the marketplace, we'll put it in the centerfold. So, it's the American entrepreneurial spirit at work.
And now, it's my understanding that Tom Prasad had a deal with Larry Flint Publications, and he sort of did it the way you would do it like in the pot business. Like he sold him a bunch of magazines, and then Flint would resell it. Is that correct?
You know, actually what it was Flint was, for a while there, was the distributor. You know, the biggest issue in the magazine business, or actually in any business like books or music, or not, of course it's changing now because of the internet, but back in those days, the biggest, you could create a great magazine, but how do you get it on the newsstand?
Right.
How do you get the distribution? And Tom made a deal with Larry Flint early on for distribution to get the magazine. So it would be a deal where Larry's company would purchase the magazine at one price, or make a deal to sell it at one price, and then distribute it and get a fee for the distribution. That's basically how that worked.
Yeah, so Tom had a guaranteed paycheck every month for the magazine because he was selling it off as a chunk.
And the magazine was successful from the first issue.
Yeah.
And mainly because also at that point, there was no other outlet for advertising all of the accessories and the paraphernalia. The papers, roach clips, bongs, pipes, all that stuff that these products that hit the marketplace. There was no other place to advertise them. So High Times became very successful because the advertisers were flooding to the market, to the magazine.
How was Tom able to get in touch with Larry Flint and make that deal?
Good question. Tom, here's the thing with Tom. Tom was like the creative spirit behind the magazine. There was really a guy named Bob Singer and another guy whose name was Ed. I can't remember.
Ed Rosenthal.
Well, there was Ed Rosenthal. Yeah, Ed Rosenthal. But there was another guy, too, who actually, I believe, just died a little while ago. These guys were magazine guys.
Okay.
Bob Singer worked, I think, for Playboy before he came to work at High Times. So they understood distribution. They understood the magazine business. And they were able to. Tom was the creative genius behind it, but he had people who really understood the business aspect of it as well. And the magazine is still going strong today, which is incredible. I mean, how many magazines can you say that about that are still around? And it's the only magazine ever that was devoted to an illegal activity.
Now, how did you become the editor of High Times? Was that before or after your bust?
That was after, actually. Back in the early days, I was what you call me, a consultant. I was sat in on editorial meetings. I provided the magazine with photographs from around the world, from trips that we were doing. So I was involved in the early days as part of I guess what you'd call a think tank that figured out what we were going to do and how we were going to make this magazine work, and also getting material, getting content. That was part of what I did. Then I got locked up in 1982, and Tom died. 79, I think, was when Tom died, if I'm not mistaken. Can't remember. But, and Bob Singer was still involved with the magazine. So when I got out, Michael Kennedy, actually, who was the lawyer who was in charge of the trust that owned the magazine, was a good friend of mine. And when I got out, he said, "Richard, would you like to come back and work for the magazine and help us?" And I did. I went back to work for the magazine, and then at a certain point, I took over and became the editor and publisher for a while.
Now, you had no problem with your parole working at High Times?
Well, I was after my parole.
After parole.
I had to wait till the parole was over, yeah. I had a lot of problems with my parole officer, but fortunately that wasn't one of them.
Okay. Now, what about, there's a lot of questions about the death of Tom Farsad. Some people believe it perhaps wasn't a suicide. What do you think?
No, I think he definitely committed suicide.
Okay.
No question in my mind that he blew his brains out. He even told his wife he was going to do it, and he did it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, so okay, yeah. Well, how did your bust come down? How'd you? I guess they were watching you though, because I know that Dana had a big case, and Bill Kunstler was representing them. They had to be watching everybody around. By the way, let me ask you a question before we get to this. How was everybody getting away with all that? Okay, how was everybody getting away with it? There had to be a lot of surveillance down there on the Lower East Side on all these guys, but yet everybody was doing a lot of weight. How was everybody getting away with that? Well,
to answer your question, everybody wasn't getting away with it. I mean, people were getting busted from time to time, but it was. I think really the focus wasn't in the beginning. The focus was not on going after pot dealers or pot smugglers. That changed in the early days of the Drug Enforcement Administration, and their goal. I mean, I remember the marijuana desk was was low. But then when people started to make a lot of money and it became a huge business and organized crime tried to move in, then it became a higher priority. And they created these laws that, before 1980, the most amount of time you could get for no matter how much marijuana you smuggled was 5 years. They changed that law in 1980 and made it 15 years. And then they added, later on, the continuing criminal enterprise, or what they call the kingpin statute. So as they saw people making more and more money, the thing about the government is they hate it when people are making money and not paying their taxes or whatever it is that upsets them. That they have to feel like they got to get their piece of the action. So that's when it really started to get ugly. And then, of course, the cocaine thing changed everything, too. In the late 70s and early 80s, when the Colombians started bringing in massive amounts of coke, a lot of people got strung out on cocaine. A lot of people there was a lot more violence in the business, which I think attracted a lot more heat. So to answer your question, in the early days, I think the cops were kind of stumbling around, trying to figure it out. And then ultimately, as they started busting more and more people and threatening them with bigger time, then people became informants. And the only way they were ever able to make these cases against a lot of guys, the only way I got pinched was because of people ratting me out. They never arrested me with a load or bringing in a load. What I got arrested for was what they call a dry conspiracy. They arrested someone else for doing something else. In fact, they arrested a couple of Lebanese guys here in New York City for trying to sell some heroin. And they said, well, we know that your father is chief of customs in Lebanon, and he knows this guy. And they showed them a picture of me. And then the guy, one of the guys was the son of the chief of customs, this guy Nasif Barrow. He said, oh, yeah, Mr. Richard, I know. They said, we'll make a deal with you. If you can get this guy so that we arrest him, then you can go. And that was the deal they made. And that's the way law enforcement works. They bust some lower-level guy. They say, listen, we want the guy who's above you. We'll give you a deal where they did it with me, too. After they arrested me, they wanted Norman Mailer. They said Mailer wasn't even involved, but he was a big name. They wanted his name. He and I owned property together. They figured they could get a conspiracy case against him. They offered me that deal, too. They said, give us Mailer, give us some of these other guys. There were other guys who were much bigger, who were really in the business. A guy named Jimmy Chago down in Texas, and guys up in Boston who I knew who were still out there, guys here in New York that they wanted, and they were willing to make that same deal with me. Rat out your friends, give us these people, give us everybody, and then we'll make a deal with you where you'll do a year or two and you'll go home. But I refused, and I refused over and over again. I refused, and they took me to court up in Maine. They charged me with marijuana importation and distribution. They gave me 15 years, which was the maximum. Then before I even got to the prison, I was on my way to the prison. When I get to New York, they take me off the bus, and they say, well, we got another case for you. And I'm like, what? What do you mean another case? I just got 15 years in Maine. They said, well, now we're going to charge you under the kingpin statute with continuing criminal enterprise, and you're now facing life. So they brought me over to the DEA, and they said, are you ready to cooperate now? And I was like, no, I'm not ready to cooperate. And if you thought what I did up in Maine in my trial was crazy, wait and see what I do down here in New York. So, I mean, to me, after looking back on it, I think that the one good thing that I did in all those years was refusing to rat out my friends and become a snitch and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, being despised by people. Now I have respect. Wherever I go, people remember, oh, yeah, Stratton kept his mouth shut. He did the time, and he paid for it, his responsibility. So that's how they make the cases. That's how 90%, I would say, of dope cases are made, by busting somebody low level who gives the authorities information so that they can arrest the higher-ups.
Okay, before we get into all that, I got a couple of specific questions again about Bleecker Street. Like a guy like Mickey Caesar, Dollar Joint, the Pope of Pot, right? How could he get away with an operation like that, so blatantly out in the open? I know he did do some time ultimately, but he had a long run.
Yeah.
You know?
He did. Yeah, he was like riding around on bicycles delivering products.
Yeah. How did he get away with that?
Like I said, I don't think they thought of it as a high priority, especially the lower level. I mean, he was dealing like ounces and, running around. I mean, I'm sure his basically by the end of the week he had sold a lot of pot, but it was really their thing was we got to get the big guys with lots of money, the guys that are bringing in the massive loads, like me and the other people. And when I ended up going to prison, half the people that I would run into, I already knew them from, guys from California who were in the same business, or from Texas, or from Canada that were in the business, the big-time smugglers. And, as I said, there was this so-called Hippie Mafia that was really responsible for keeping America high during the 70s and 80s.
Okay, one last question about Bleecker Street again. Right around that time, around 82, 81, 1980, right around that time, there was a rip-off that went down at 9 Bleecker Street. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Oh, no? Okay. There was a big rip-off that went on with some guys that went in there. They were like military style, like DEA-type guys. They had some kind of... Yeah, and they okay. Okay, if you don't know any details about that, just something I always wonder about. Now, to talk about how when they got you... Okay, they made some deal with these Lebanese guys whose father was the customs guy. But what dirt did they have on you? Did you have anything in your possession when they came and got you?
No, and that was the funny thing about it. When they tried me in New York, they had no evidence as far as physical evidence. So all they had, and they said, look, there was 15,000 pounds of hashish that these guys brought in. And they had it stored in the safe house out in Staten Island, but they never got a gram of it. And they had an empty plastic bag that they held up and said, we have checked the residue in this bag, and there is trace amounts of tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. That was their evidence, and the people who testified against me. That was all they had. And then they had, of course, travel records and stuff like that, so that they could say, well, he was here on such and such a date, and then he went there, and then how does this guy support himself, and how does he own a ranch in Texas and a place up in Maine, and so they created this picture of a guy. And basically, when I went to trial in New York, which was my second trial, my defense was, I was a smuggler, I smuggled hashish, smuggled marijuana, but I already got convicted up in Maine for it. And this second prosecution is strictly to try to get me to cooperate with the government. And the government this is a malicious prosecution. I've already been convicted. I got 15 years up in Maine, and now they're trying me all over again. And ultimately, because of that, I was able to get out. That's how I ended up getting out, because when I appealed my sentence, they gave me another sentence in New York. I appealed the sentence saying that it was coercive rather than punitive, because they used that whole second case in New York for one reason and one reason only, to get me to cooperate with the government, and primarily to get me to give them Norman Mailer.
Right.
So that was my defense, and that became the basis under which I attacked my sentence in New York, and that became the basis under which the Second Circuit Court of Appeals vacated my sentence, remanded me back to court for resentencing, and I ended up doing 10 years instead of the total of 25, which I would have had to do if the original sentence had held up.
Well, thank God for that. Now, you mentioned you mentioned you had a stash house on Staten Island. I'm from Staten Island. Where was the stash house?
It was, oh, come on, I'm going to be able to think of this.
Toad Hill.
Toad Hill, right, Toad Hill.
What part of Toad Hill? That's an expensive area. What'd you do? You bought a house? You rented a house?
No, we rented a house.
You rented a house on Toad Hill?
Two of my partners lived on Staten Island. A guy named Steve Parness and another guy named Bobby Goldstein. They both came from Staten Island. That's how we ended up using the stash house in Staten Island. They had the house, they had the house for about a year before we put any product in it.
Right.
Because we wanted to establish like a residency. And one of the guys the only guy who lived in that house, had a legitimate job. He was a welder. He would get up every day, put his tools in his truck and drive off like he was going to work, come back at the end of the day. So it was an established routine. And once the load came into New Jersey, we moved it from New Jersey into the stash house, it didn't really create any kind of additional attention. So by the time they busted us and they went out to that stash house in Staten Island, it had already been vacated. A new tenant had moved in. And when they tried to claim that there was trace amounts of THC, we said, well, how do we know that the new tenant, our lawyer said, how do we know the new tenant didn't smoke pot and that the trace amounts of THC came from the new tenant? So Bobby Goldstein, who was the guy who rented the house, actually got acquitted. They didn't even convict him. So, their case was very, very weak. But in my case, they had a lot more evidence because they had these Lebanese guys testify against me. Now,
when we'd come into Port Newark, New Jersey, would come in through?
Yeah.
Okay. And
that came into Newark.
In a container?
Well, it was in 3 containers.
Okay.
And what happened was that at that time there was a war going on in the Middle East, the first Gulf War between Iraq and Iran. And you couldn't get these dates, these little brown dates that they grow in Iraq. And those dates they use in this country for cake mixes and different kinds of prepared foods. So my partner comes to me and he says, listen, Richard, if you can get these dates and have them shipped into this country, we can get in them because we have this company, this big food processing company that will buy the dates and have no idea that you're putting the hash in there. So that's what we did. I went to Iraq and bought all these. I bought like 1.5 million kilos of dates and shipped them overland from Baghdad to Beirut. And then I bought the hash in Lebanon, up in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon. It took months for me to get this load together. Shipped it down to the port. Then what we did was we put these boxes. We had tin containers where we put the hash in, and we put them in the carton and put dates, a layer of dates on the top and a layer of dates on the bottom. So in this 3 containers full of cartons, there were some containers that had nothing but dates in them, but there was also 15,000 pounds of hash hidden in amongst the dates in the other containers. So that's how we ended up getting that in. It almost got busted. What happened was that when the load finally arrived in Newark, Customs called up my partner who had a bonded warehouse over there, and ordinarily they would just look at this, it's coming in this big food company that's been doing business for 30 years, and yeah, it's a date, but something spooked them about this load because we figured later on what happened was that there was a lot of heroin coming out of Lebanon at that time. And because the dates had originated in Iraq but had come through Beirut, they thought, well, there's something a little bit off kilter about this. Although it could have been explained by the fact that there was a war going on in that part of the world. So the customs guys call up my partner and they go, well, we want to send some customs guys with the containers back to your warehouse, and we want to do a secondary inspection when we get to the warehouse. Now, that was very unusual. Ordinarily, they would have just said, oh, okay, they open up the back of the container, they look at a couple of boxes, they coming from Iraq, makes perfect sense. It's a big company. Now, that big company had no idea, of course, that our hash was in there. But we had the warehouse. So our deal was we were going to get the dates to the warehouse, take our hash out, give the dates to the company, the big company that was importing them. So they call up and they say, well, we want to escort these containers to the warehouse and do a secondary inspection. At that point, my partner freaked out. Because his father owned the warehouse, owned the trucking company, and he was like, oh, God, we're going to get busted. My father's going to lose his business. We're all going to go to jail. And I said, well, look, if we don't go pick these containers up, then they're going to know that we know that there's something in there. You got to act like it's perfectly legal, like it's perfectly normal. So, as I said, no, there were, I said, look, here's the deal. There was actually 7 containers. There was 3 that contained hash and date, and 4 that contained nothing but date. So I said, what you do is you go down there on like a late Friday afternoon and pick up just a container that has dates in it. The customs guys will go back to the warehouse with you. They'll inspect that container. They want to go home for the weekend. It's getting late on a Friday afternoon, and hopefully they'll be satisfied, and they'll let us pick up the rest of the days. That's ultimately what happened. Although when we got down to the docks to pick up the container, we didn't get to choose which container we wanted to pick up. They just said, take that container and take that container and take that container. We took 3 containers. It turns out one of the containers, actually 2 of the containers, contained hash and dates. And they had dogs. They brought dogs into the warehouse when they were inspecting these cartons. But those dogs apparently were trained to smell heroin. They weren't trained to smell hash. And the smell of the dates and the sugary, sort of syrupy smell of dates mixed with the hash must have thrown the dogs off, because they never even found any of the hash. So we got really lucky. We ended up spending all weekend just getting all our product out, and then Monday the customs guys called up and they said, "Well, we're satisfied. You can come and get the rest of the containers. It looks good to us." It was unbelievable. I detailed the whole scam in the book. I write about the whole offload and how difficult it was. In fact, then we get the U.S. Department of Agriculture comes down and inspects the dates, and they go, "Well, these dates don't pass the USDA infestation rate. You can't bring the dates into this country." So we had to ship the dates to Canada and sell them in Canada.
Yeah, that could have been a loss. You could have taken a loss on the dates.
Had a loss on the dates.
The easy part of the deal, right? Hey, did you ever think of training your own dogs to sniff and so you could make sure that you could defeat the dogs?
No, but I have a dog who's a lab who's probably as good as any dog that the customs guys use. But the thing is with those, they train those dogs for specific smells. They have bomb dogs, they have cadaver dogs, and the dogs are trained for specific smells. So you can't just bring a dog in who's trained for one drug and expect him to smell another drug. I never knew that. I didn't know that until after these guys came with their dogs, and the dogs didn't smell the hash. Because when I walked into the warehouse after they had made their inspection, I could smell hash.
Right.
Maybe because I was used to it, but I thought, man, these dogs, man.
I could imagine. Yeah, that's right. The whole place must have stunk when you walked in there. Now, 15,000 pounds, though. Now, you're taking this to a little house on Staten Island. Would you use, like, a rent-a-truck? How'd you get from the dock to the house, and how'd you get into the house without people getting suspicious?
Yeah, no, we had to bring it in by these big trucks. It was like a U-Haul type truck or a rider truck. Looks like you're moving furniture or something like that. And there was a whole room in the basement that was just full of these cartons of hashish. It's a beautiful sight, man.
Yeah.
And I saw that when I walked into that basement and saw that there. I thought, because it took me probably 6 months from beginning to end to get that thing in. But it was $15 million worth of hash by the time it hit the market in this country. So it was worth the time and the effort. But it was. I mean, the hairiest part of it all was in Beirut. There was a war going on. There was a civil war going on. The building that I was living in got hit by a rocket. Fortunately for us, we were out that night, but it was really dangerous over there. We were lucky that we didn't get killed.
Okay, we got a break coming up. It's going to be a nice 5-minute little break. But real quick, how long did it take you to sell 15,000 pounds?
It took about 6 months, 8 months total. We had to take a bunch of it to Canada ultimately. Because of what happened here, the market was flooded in New York with lower grade hash, and people weren't interested. I mean, we sold a lot here in New York ultimately, but 15,000 pounds is a lot of hash.
Yeah.
So we ended up taking most of it to Montreal, Quebec, and Toronto, where this friend of mine was unbelievable at how much that guy could sell. He could sell like a ton a week up there. That's how huge his market was.
But even after you got it here to the States and Staten Island, then you had to defeat another border to get it up to Canada.
Yeah, we had to do a double smuggle.
Now, what about it starts drying out? What do you do? How do you preserve it?
Well, we use these vacuum-sealed bags, plastic vacuum-sealed bags that you suck all the air out of it and you seal it. So it had a shelf life of like 2 or 3 years in those things.
The Daisy Seal meal.
high grade plastic, and that actually cut down the smell.
Right.
A big deal too. So that was the way that we ended up keeping it fresh. And then, still there were 50 kilos got pinched at one place, and you lose 100 kilos over here. So there's still problems. There was plenty of problems.
Now, what about with the marijuana too? Because now the commercial Colombian that was always dry. It was always crap to begin with. Hey, by the way, too, it was funny because you'd always find like a peanut shell in there, right, or a cigarette butt. Do you remember that?
Yeah, or a shoe sole or something like that. Or rocks. Yeah.
It was so.
The Mexicans too. They'd throw anything. But for me, I say somewhere in my memoirs or somewhere that I would rather bring in 2 tons of really good quality product than 20 tons of low-grade commercial weed that you're going to have difficulty selling that you really wouldn't smoke yourself. I wouldn't bring anything in that I wouldn't smoke myself. That would not be my own personal stash.
Oh, here's the break coming up. Richard Stratton, the book is Smuggler's Blues, A True Story of the Hippie Mafia. I got to tell you, man, I'm loving hearing this for obvious reasons, okay? It brings back a lot of memories. And we're going to come back with much more. Okay, we're going to get into this whole Norman Mailer story, which I remember reading that story in the newspaper back in the 80s when it happened. And I've been looking for this story for years. And suddenly we booked this guest, Richard Stratton. It turns out this is the guy behind the story. So just an incredible week for me here. More of Richard Stratton, Smuggler's Blues, A True Story of the Hippie Mafia, after this break.
All clear.
Okay, but don't forget, you got to play the...
Oh.
Hey, are you liking the story?
Oh, it's an amazing story. Very interesting. Cool. I can't wait till the second half.
Oh yeah, because this whole Norman Mailer thing is great.
Yeah,
all right, bro. Play
the
stuff there.
I'll put up the cue.
Thank you, man.
American institution. American Freedom Radio.
Did you know there are 3 million edible food plants on Earth, and none have the nutritional value of the hemp plant? HempUSA.org offers you hemp protein powder. It does not contain chemicals or THC, is non-GMO, and is 100% gluten-free. Hemp protein powder burns fat, builds muscle, contains 53% protein, and feeds the body the nutrients it needs. Call 888-910-4367 and see what our powder, seeds, and oil can do for you. Only at HempUSA.org. HempUSA.org introduces 3 brand new detox formulations of microplant powder. Brain Fuel for depression, bipolar disorders, and stress. Total Care, anti-cancer agent that cleans the liver and organs and increases memory. Rejuvenate, invigorates and heals the body, mind, and spirit. These products are your alternative to pharmaceuticals. Call 888-910-4367 and like us on Facebook. We ship worldwide. Only at HempUSA.org.
The last hour of American Freedom Radio you have been listening to is proudly sponsored in part by BigReggaeMix.com, the global healing station.
Produced by Mitch Santel and executive produced by none other than Errol Brown, winner of 5 Grammy Awards and the last producer and engineer of Bob Marley. Visit us now at BigReggaeMix.com for the latest show schedule, updates, and blog postings. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter, too. BigReggaeMix.com.
Everybody talking about gun control. Gotta get rid of the guns. I like guns. You got a gun, you don't have to work out. I ain't working out. I ain't jogging. You don't need no gun control. You know what you need? We need some bullet control. We need to control the bullets. That's right. I think all bullets should cost $5,000. You know why? Because if a bullet costs $5,000, there'll be no more innocent bystanders. Every time somebody gets shot, you be like, damn, he must have did something. So they put $50,000 worth of bullets in his hand. And people would think before they kill somebody, if a bullet costs $5,000, man, I would blow your head off if I could afford it. I'm gonna get me another job. I'm gonna start saving some money, and you a dead man.
You
listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, the network who perseveres in delivering intelligent debate, constructive dialogue with true independence. The freedom to broadcast the truth is not free at all. So what is American Freedom Radio worth to you? The empowering information with fun, honest and pure integrity behind it provides an example to follow. Friendships to flourish with a moral altruism that pulls no punches. The hosts sacrifice and show remarkable discipline in their duty to deliver quality radio in service to the community with strength, wisdom and loyalty. The founders of AFR wish to thank you personally for sharing your views and insights to make the best radio and alternative media. Now it's time for you to give something back and play a vital role in the future of America. Be as generous with us as we've been with you. Click on the donate banner at AmericanFreedomRadio.com or volunteer by emailing AmericanFreedomRadio.com. Vaccine, psychotropic drugs, and artillery batteries not included.
No rules, no rules, no taboo topics, no fear of doom, We are American Freedom Radio, American Freedom Radio.
It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. We're here with Richard Stratton. He's the author of Smuggler's Blues, a true story of the Hippie Mafia. Fascinating stuff. And I can't thank you enough, Richard, for coming here and telling me all your stories.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Hey, because, you got to realize, I was a kid, when I knew Dana and AJ and all these guys. These guys were heroes to me, So, you're a legend to me, my friend. And I really look up to you in a lot of crazy ways that maybe people can't understand. Now, we were talking about, the Colombian would dry out, no one would care. But now when you started getting to the good sensibilia, the exotic marijuana, sometimes it would start to grow mold on it. Did you ever run across that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, that was it. If pot is not carefully cured, it's not properly cured, it retains too much moisture.
Right.
And then it's put in sacks or, then put in plastic, wrapped in plastic, it'll get moldy. And I've had that happen when we open up bales, and oh my God. And this one big load of Colombian pot that we brought in, one of the last big loads that I did, it was an offload actually that I did up off the coast of Maine. It was over 10 tons. It was completely spoiled. It was soaked in bilge water and mold, and it was just, we had to end up just digging a big hole and dumping it in there. Couldn't sell it. So, that was definitely, spoilage was a big problem. Whenever you're dealing with, with a plant, with vegetable matter, there's always issues of spoilage and mold and any kind of contamination that might get in there. Then, of course, the Fed started spraying the paraquat. Yeah, so that became a big issue. I can remember being in Mexico one time down in the Sierra Madre del Sur, way, way up high in the mountains, where I used to buy this great pot that came from Guerrero, Acapulco Gold and whatnot, Sensimilla. And I was standing with the guy who was the grower, who was a real sweet guy, great guy. His whole village basically lived on the money that they made from growing and selling pot. And we looked across the valley, and he pointed to the hillside on the opposite side of the valley that looked like a big black smear. And basically what had happened was that they had sprayed that whole side of the mountain with paraquat. And little kids who were, maybe been working out in the fields, who inhaled the paraquat would get sick and sometimes die. Terrible. I mean, when you think of what the money and the lives and the huge amount of waste that's gone into waging this ridiculous war on plants. I mean, the whole war on drugs, from my perspective, is completely a fiasco and a very expensive and destructive one. I mean, he created this huge prison system this gulag in America, what I call the American gulag of prisons. I mean, in the 1980s, when I was locked up from 1980 to 1990 when I got out, the prison population expanded by tenfold. There was only 30,000 federal prisoners at the time I went in. There was over 300,000 federal prisoners by the time I got out, which 8 years later. And largely, I mean, 90% of them were nonviolent drug offenders. The whole war on drugs has been unbelievably destructive to this country. You think of the families that are affected by it. You think of the number of people who've died or ended up dying in prison. And people can say, oh, well, you did something illegal, you should go to jail. Yeah, maybe you should go to jail. But for that length of time, and maybe we should look and say, well, maybe the laws are wrong. Maybe, you know, this whole idea of my country, right or wrong, I don't think, to me, that's not an American attitude. To me, the American attitude is question authority. You can't necessarily trust people who run this country. A lot of times they don't know what they're doing, or they have some kind of hidden agenda. I mean, I think this is probably more pertinent right now when we're in the middle of this presidential campaign and we're looking at these alternatives that we have here, on either side. I'm not happy. Bill Clinton and his wife. Well, who's Bill Clinton? Bill Clinton was the guy who said, I didn't inhale. Bullshit, you didn't inhale. I knew the guy who sold him pot over when he was at Oxford, at Cambridge, or wherever it was. He used to sell him ounces every couple of weeks. If he wasn't inhaling, why was he coming back and buying more? He was a liar. His wife was not to be trusted. These people can't be trusted. And the other guy, the maniac on the other side, is no better. He's worse. So, you know, I think as Americans, we have a responsibility in living in a participatory democracy to always question those people who are in power. And the people who look at me and say, oh, well, you broke the law, you're a criminal, you're an outlaw. You know what? So what? I mean, there used to be laws in this country that women couldn't vote. There used to be laws in this country that black people couldn't sit in the bus and couldn't go to the counters and eat with white people. These were laws that existed. There's still laws in this country that are completely ridiculous and don't deserve to be there. So Americans, I think, have a responsibility to break the laws that are wrong, to participate in the democracy, and to fight against this totalitarian mentality that we have that ultimately, you know, wants to take over and tell you how to live your lives.
I hear you, man. We got to resist. We got to resist the oppression that we're under. But I tell you, the headline for this show is, if he wasn't inhaling, why'd he come back and buy more? That's the greatest line. I love it. Now, back to your case, though, okay? Your case. Now, first, a couple of things. Now, was there any evidence of wiretaps in your case when they arrested you?
No, there was no evidence of wiretaps. Not on my phones. None on my phones. There were some tapes that had been made, and it's kind of an unfortunate story, but there was a guy who was working for me who was a money courier. Basically, that was all his job. He schlepped money around from this country back to the Lebanese. He took money he went to Canada and picked up money from my people there. That was what he did. He was a money guy. And he was very friendly with Mailer. In fact, I ended up hiring him as a favor to Mailer because he wait a minute, I lost him here.
You okay?
Yeah, can you hear me? I dropped my phone.
No, I hear you fine, yeah.
Okay, so anyway, this guy ended up making some tapes. He was introduced to a guy that was an undercover DEA agent. Now, I had already been arrested. I was arrested in Los Angeles, and that's another whole story. So I'm in custody out there, and I get in touch with this woman that I work with, my girlfriend. I tell her, whatever you do, reach this guy, Buzz. I call him Biff in the book, but his name was Buzz. And tell him whatever he does, don't speak to the Lebanese, because the Lebanese are no good. The only reason I got arrested was because they set me up. And I knew that, so I made sure that the word got back to him, not to deal with the Lebanese. What does he do? He has a meeting with this guy, the Lebanese guy, and he says, oh, yeah, I heard from Mr. Richard. He tells me I shouldn't be meeting with you. He doesn't trust you. He said, I think he's just paranoid. He's overly worried. Then that guy introduces him to an undercover DEA agent posing as a drug dealer wanting to buy hashish, right? And now the hash is all gone at this point. So I don't even know where they thought they were going to get this hash. They start to make this deal. They arrest this guy, and they say to him within 5 minutes after they arrest him, "We want you to get Norman Mailer on the phone," and arranged to meet with Norman Mailer, which he did. And they wired him up. They wired him up with undercover wire. Set him into this lunch meeting with Mailer, and he's sitting there trying to get Mailer to implicate himself on tape, saying, "Well, Richard was smuggling hash and blah, 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 and this, that, and the other." And Mailer kept saying, "Listen, whatever Richard was doing, that's Richard's business. I'm not going to sit here and say anything about this or that." So the tapes turned out to be inconclusive, and the government tried to claim that this guy had warned Mailer that he was wired, which may or may not be true, I don't know. But those were the only tapes that they were able to introduce, was the tapes that were made with this undercover DEA agent and this guy, where he was saying, "Yeah, Stratton brought in this huge load of hash. There's some of it still left out on Staten Island." There wasn't. I don't know what he was talking about. He was that far away from it. He was only a money courier. He wasn't really part of the main part of the conspiracy. But those are the only tapes that they had, and I was not on any of those tapes. So the case against me actually in New York was remarkably weak, and there was no physical evidence. But, you get a bunch of people in the stand who say, "Yeah, that's the guy right there. He's the boss. Everything that happened to him." Then they brought this real estate agent in from Texas who said, "Yes, I sold the guy 3 ranches over a period of 4 or 5 years, and he always came with, briefcases full of cash." So that was the kind of evidence that they had against me.
Who was your lawyer?
Well, I actually represented myself.
Really?
I had an idiot for a client and a maniac for a lawyer. So I used to tell people, because I was my own client and my own lawyer. But meanwhile,
Why? You had a ton of money. Why couldn't you hire a really top lawyer? All the left court and those guys. Why not?
Well, here's what it was. There were 4 co-defendants and me. So there's a total of 5 people on trial. Those 4 defendants underneath me had the top lawyers in New York City, including Ivan Fisher, who was a dear friend of mine. Now, I was charged under the kingpin statute, who was supposedly being the boss of those 4 guys.
Right.
So our strategy was, when I met with the lawyers, I was like, "Look, if I sit there and some lawyer gets up and talks in my behalf,
right,
the jury keeps looking over at me, they're going to say, 'Yeah, that guy must be the boss.' But if I get up and question these witnesses, and if I can speak directly to the jury, I got a chance to beat this thing." And they agreed with me. They all agreed with me, and they said, "You know what, we think you're right." Meanwhile, I had already been convicted and sentenced to 15 years up in Maine. So my defense in New York was what they call an affirmative defense, where I said to the jury, "Yeah, I'm a marijuana smuggler. I admit it. I smuggled marijuana and hash, but I got convicted of it and sentenced to 15 years up in Maine. And this trial here is a creation of the government. It's a vindictive prosecution.
Double jeopardy.
It has one purpose in mind." Well, I fought it on double jeopardy. I fought double jeopardy, but they got around that by saying, "Well, yeah, you were convicted up in Maine of importation and distribution, but you weren't charged under the kingpin statute.
Oh, okay.
We got a new statute for you here." It took 2 years for me to just fight that aspect of the case, the double jeopardy issue, because the district court judge denied it, and I had to appeal it to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals before they could even take me to trial, the second trial in New York. And all this time, I'm studying the law, becoming a jailhouse lawyer, writing my own briefs. And then I figured, and I spoke to the other lawyers, and they said, "Richard, we think it's a good idea. We think if you get up there and talk and the jury gets to know you, you have a shot to beat this thing." And ultimately, even though I did get convicted in New York, in a sense, I won, because my defense was that it was the only reason they were taking me to trial in New York was to try to force me to cooperate and give them Mailer. And then when the judge sentenced me, after I got convicted, she said, on the record, "The reason I'm giving you 25 years, the reason I'm giving you so much time, not because," she said, "I agree with you. I don't think marijuana is such a dangerous drug either. But," she said, "you refuse to cooperate with the government. Therefore," and she based my sentence on my refusal to cooperate. Now, that turns out to be illegal. The sentence becomes coercive rather than punitive. And when I got back to prison and started looking at the Second Circuit law cases that said you can't give someone more time for refusing to cooperate. You can give them less time for cooperating. But once the sentence is made to be coercive, it becomes illegal. And I appealed my sentence on those grounds, appealed it to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. They vacated my sentence, remanded me for resentencing in front of a different judge who ended up taking the 10 years that they had given me, the additional 10 years that they had given me in New York to make a total of 25, and put them together with the 15 that I already had in Maine. So in essence, even though I lost, I won, because I got no more time in New York for refusing to cooperate. I may be one of the few people who actually had this sentence vacated for refusing to cooperate. So
now, what about your assets? Were they able to find your money and snatch all that up?
Well, they got all the physical property. I mean, I had the ranch in Texas. We had a place up in Maine that Mailer and I owned. So there was a lot of physical property, like trucks and tractors and vehicles and, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment, animals. I had a lot of horses. I had a lot of cattle. They got all that. They took all that stuff and they sold it all. God only knows how much they got for it, but it was a lot. But they didn't get all the cash because there was some cash stashed here and there that they never got. There was a house in Hawaii that they never knew about and they never got, which my girlfriend ended up living in. So, there was enough money around to pay the lawyers and to keep people somewhat happy for all the time that I was locked up. Of course, by the time I got out, there was nothing left. And when people came to me and offered to pay me the money that they owed me at the time I went away, and there was a considerable amount still on the street at that point, I just refused it and said no.
Really?
Because I knew that if I had taken that money, they could have, and then that person got arrested and said, well, I went and paid Stratton for a load of hash back in, then I was still part of the conspiracy and I could still go back to prison. And if I had been arrested a second time after that, it would have been mandatory life with no parole.
Gotcha.
So there was no way I was going to get back in the business. And, I tell people this story, but it's true. As recently as 3 weeks ago, they tried to set me up.
Really?
I know, yeah. A guy came to town who I hadn't seen for many years, and he shows up at where my son was having his Little League practice. Calls me up on my cell phone. He says, hey, I'm in town, blah, blah, blah. What are you doing? I said, well, I'm over at Pier 40. My son's having, he said, oh, yeah, I'll drop by and see you. So he comes over and he calls me and he says, oh, yeah, I'm sitting out in my car. So I go and get in his car and why does this guy want to see me? He starts talking about my book. Oh, yeah, I heard about your book. I want to buy a bunch of copies of your book. And I'm like, great.
Go to Amazon.
Sure. Go to Amazon, yeah. By the way, he goes, I got some of your old goods, your some Lebanese. I go, wow, what are you talking about? Yeah, I got this load of Lebanese. I said, listen, forget about it. I have no interest in that business. I'm not involved in it anymore. I don't want anything to do with it. Then he starts talking about commercial Mexican weed. I said, forget about it, man. You're talking to the wrong guy. I'm not in the business anymore. Please leave and get out of here and don't call me ever again. Because I'm sure that he was trying to set me up. I'm sure that they said at some point I found out later he had been busted. And he probably said, look, I could probably get Stratton back. And they thought, well, yeah, with his book coming out, he'd make a nice, trophy to put on our shelves. He wants to now start bragging about what he did back in the day. We'll lock his ass up again.
Gotcha.
So
now let me ask you about this Mailer story, okay? Because now I remember reading this in the paper in New York City when it happened. I remember reading about. I can tell you what I remember. I remember reading Norman Mailer was somehow involved in this 100-pound hashish deal, several hundred pounds, but that he somehow explained his way out of it because he said that he was researching a book. Okay, that's what I remember reading. Now, I've gone back. I remember this like it was yesterday. And I've gone back over the years, and I've tried to look up this story, and I could never find it. And I thought maybe I was imagining this. I even asked AJ. When AJ was on the show, I asked him if he heard about it, and he didn't know the story.
Well, you got part of the story correct. Basically, what it was, when I got arrested up in Maine, but don't forget, at that point, I had been involved with High Times Magazine. I had published in Rolling Stone, and I was known as a writer. But so I tried to say, my defense in Maine, my first case was that I was a writer and that I was doing this all as research for a book. That was my defense.
Right.
And I had people get up and testify and say, yeah, he was a writer. But the judge didn't go for it at all. The judge was like, yeah, you may have been a writer, but you were also very much involved in the pot business. And he was angry with me. He didn't like my defense at all. Meanwhile, there was other guys up there. You know, there was these Vietnam vets. Maine was a big area for smuggling pot, boats and airplanes and all kinds of stuff. And there was 3 other cases. There was the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. There was the what were they now? They were the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, or they were guys who lived. They were white Rastafarians from Jamaica, and their defense was that they were bringing in pot as they had a religious exemption, that they were bringing it in as sacrament for their church. And there was a guy named Brother Love who was like the boss of this. All these white Rastas, they were there in this jail. Then there was a bunch of Vietnam vets who were there that had been busted, and their defense was post-traumatic stress disorder, that they came back from Vietnam, and the only thing that they could do that would give them any kind of excitement like they used to get in Vietnam was to smuggle pot. So I come up there and I go, well, you know, these guys have got all these creative defenses. I'm going to try this defense, which was that I smuggled pot as research for a book. And Mailer came up and testified at my trial. He was one of the people who testified on my behalf, along with Doris Kearns Goodwin, who is the writer of those historical books about the Kennedys, and she's written several books, historical books. She's married to Richard Goodwin, who was a Kennedy speechwriter. She testified on my behalf. But yeah, he was a writer. He worked for Rolling Stone. I was going to bring Hunter Thompson up, but everybody said it's probably not a good idea to bring Hunter. He's so crazy, you never know what he'll say. So then but still, it didn't work. I got convicted. I got sentenced to 15 years. Now then, my defense in New York, was, as I said, I was going to do what they call an affirmative defense, and I was going to call Mailer as a witness to testify in New York, and they wouldn't allow him to testify. The judge wouldn't even let him in the courtroom. She said, oh, it's intimidating to the jury. She threw him out of the courtroom. So then that was in all of the newspapers. And then there was a couple of stories that came out where they talked about how the government tried to set Mailer up. They had busted into his apartment over there in Brooklyn Heights. They had planted some pot over there, and they tried to set Mailer up. The whole thing with Mailer was that, you know, he had written this essay called General Marijuana. He was one of the first legitimate, high-profile writers to write about his own use of marijuana, and he was also on the government's enemies list for the Vietnam War, for being an outspoken opponent against the war. He had marched on the Pentagon, so he was a government target. And then when they put me and him together, and we owned property together up in Maine, we owned a horse farm together. So their case was that Mailer is Stratton's friend. Stratton is a drug smuggler. Stratton makes money smuggling pot. Stratton pays Mailer for the farm. Therefore, Mailer is implicated in Stratton's smuggling operation. Not true, because Mailer, even though he knew what I did, he never invested money in it, and he never received any money as a result of it. He was very careful for this, as I was. The government was convinced. This is a time, don't forget they arrested that guy, John DeLorean, remember the guy?
Right.
They set him up in a cocaine deal. They were looking to make cases against high-profile individuals. They wanted to make drug cases. Mailer became a target because he was an outspoken opponent of the government. So they would love to have been able to say he's just really been involved in the drug business, and they wanted to discredit him. That was the whole agenda that the feds had. And they made that perfectly clear to me. When I got to New York, they brought me over to the U.S. Attorney's Office. They had the DEA agents there. I became quite friendly, actually, with one of the DEA agents, who was a good guy. He was a decent guy. And they told me, they said, look, if you give us Mailer and some of these other people, there's a couple of guys in Boston they wanted me to testify against. James Whitey Bulger, give them information about Whitey Bulger, who I knew too, but who really, they didn't even probably realize it was actually working for the FBI all those years. So, you know, they wanted to make these conspiracy cases against other people, and they made me an offer, and Mailer was at the top of that list. Give us Mailer, and give us some of these other people, and we'll figure out a way for you to walk out of here tomorrow. So that's where there was a bunch of news reports about that. Jack Anderson actually wrote something about it that was in the Washington Post about the government's attempt to set Mailer up. So it was a lot in the news at that time, and that's probably what you're remembering.
Now, did they tell?
I remember one time I was at the dinner with Mailer, and a bunch of people. Jose Torres, the fighter, was there. A few other people, and the DEA showed up at the restaurant, and checking us out, following us around. So, it's like the police state.
Yeah. Now, did they make you an offer and say to you, hey, Richard, once you rat out all these people, you can go back into business and keep selling marijuana, and if you get pulled over, you just give me a call and I'll get you out of it?
Actually, before I got arrested, this DEA agent who I became quite friendly with, he testified at my trial in Maine. He was the guy who arrested me when I got busted up there in Maine. We had this long drive. I tell the whole story in the book. I call him Bernard Wolfsheen in the book. He was a really interesting guy. He reminded me of that guy on TV, Columbo. He had this kind of walked around with this like rumpled trench coat and was always acting like he was like, absent-minded, but he was really brilliant. Jewish guy from Brooklyn, very smart. So he met me one time after I was leaving Mailer's apartment. He was outside. They were outside surveilling me, and he and I had a talk on the promenade outside in Columbia Heights. And he basically made a pitch to me, which was, come to work for us. Nobody will ever know it. Stay out on the street. You continue to sell drugs. You just give us information. Because of the contacts you have, because of the world you work in, you can do this. You can make a lot of money, and we'll never bother you. They wanted me to become, like a confidential informant that would be never have to testify at a trial, never have to wear a wire, but just continue to give them information over the years. And I'm sure that the main information they wanted information out of Lebanon. They wanted to know more about what was going on over there, particularly because a lot of heroin started to come out of that part of the world. So they made me that offer. And, for a while, for like at least 3 or 4 minutes, I actually considered it.
Sure.
It was, I thought, man, is that really the life I want to lead, where I'm working for the government as some kind of a confidential informant and people are getting arrested and going to prison because of me? No. That's not the person I want to be. I don't want to be that guy. And then, years later, I get arrested, and I'm in the county jail up in Maine, and my lawyer up there in Maine was a very well-connected lawyer who came to me one day and he said, I got a call from George Mitchell's office. Now, George Mitchell was the senator from Maine, and when I got arrested in Maine, it was the biggest, supposedly the biggest drug case in the history of the state. I don't know why, because there wasn't all that much product, but they made it out to be this huge international conspiracy, which it was. It was an international conspiracy. So they made me this offer. They said, basically, if you go back to Lebanon, they knew that I'd spent a lot of time in the Bekaa Valley, and that's where they were holding the hostages at that point. They offered me this deal. They said, if you go back there and help us to negotiate the release of these hostages, working for the government, we'll let this case go away, and we'll let all your problems go away. And we have money from Ross Perot. Ross Perot is willing to put up the money, $10 million or whatever we need to pay these hostages and get them out of Lebanon. And they made me that offer. And believe me, I was ready to take it. I was ready to say, yeah, I'll do that. But then what happened was they came back about 2 weeks later. My wife's been arrested up in Canada, and I wanted part of the deal for the Canadians to drop the charges too. And it became this whole negotiation where the Canadians were going to ultimately agree, but it took a while. And by the time we ended up reaching some kind of an agreement, they said, well, it's too late. We already got this other guy to do it. And then it turns out that other guy actually ended up ripping them off. He was a real informant, a snitch, Lebanese guy. We got them over there to Lebanon. He took the money and split. So there was a lot going on in the Middle East at that time with the hostages. CIA was over there. There was a tremendous amount of intrigue, and And the drug business and the terrorism and the arms trading were all kind of interconnected. And the government agents figured, if you got somebody who's a known hashish smuggler with a really good reputation in Lebanon, he's got a lot of control and a lot of power, which is true. And when I was in Beirut, I had armed bodyguards with me everywhere I went, and I was talking to people in government. You know, there was CIA people over there. There was a lot of Delta Force people over there because of what was going on with the hostages at that time. So it was fascinating, but it was also very dangerous.
Do you plan on making a movie out of this?
Well, you know, there's been some talk about a TV series. There's been a lot of talk about a TV series. You know, I did a TV series that was on Showtime for 3 years called Street Time,
right,
which was based on my experiences on parole and what they call the Special Offenders Unit of a federal parole office, which always fascinated me because after I get out of prison, I was on what they call special parole. Now, what that means is that you got to report every week. You can't leave the 5 boroughs. You can't go anywhere without permission of your parole officer. They assume you're going to go back into illegal activity. You've been busted for what they call sophisticated criminal activity. So it's extremely hands-on, intense parole supervision. And it usually is for people who are either organized crime or people who have a history of dangerous criminal activity, like armed robberies of armored cars or banks, and some of these big-time burglars, and then people who have mental illness issues. Those are the people that end up in special offenders. So I was in special offenders, and it fascinated me, and I thought I ultimately came up with this idea to do a TV series about it, which was Street Time. It starred Rob Morrow and Terrence Howard, and went on for 3 years, and basically was about the parole officers and the parolees coming out of prison and how their lives would connect. And it's a really good show. So anyway, to get back to your question, yeah, I'm talking to people now about the possibility of doing a TV show that would tell the whole story of that so-called hippie mafia, and maybe even get into some of this other stuff that I was exposed to, being the connections between arms dealers and drug dealers and international terrorism.
Okay, now back to when you were in action in the 70s and the 80s and the 80s. Did you have any rip-offs? Did you ever get ripped off? Stuck up?
No,
okay.
Never did.
Any of your loads get ripped off though?
No.
Really?
Never lost a load. Never lost a load to the government, and never lost a load to any other smugglers. The only product loss that we had was from what we talked about earlier, spoilage.
Right.
There was 10 tons that was soaked in diesel fuel and bilge water, and then stuff like that would happen. I can remember once we had this big lodge that I owned up in Maine, and there was one whole wing of it that was filled with pot that was just completely contaminated. We had to end up burying it. But never did, and I think largely that's because the people that I dealt with were all part of what I call the Hippie Mafia, and they knew each other, and they had good reputations. So I didn't deal with anybody that I didn't really know. And one of the things that I do talk about in the book is that at a certain point, the real mafia,
right,
the Italian mafia, tried to muscle in on my business.
No.
And they called me to a sit-down in Boston, and I met with a guy who introduced himself and said, "My name is Mike Capuana, rhymes with marijuana," and he wanted me to pay him $1 million in cash, and he wanted to take half of every load of hashish that I brought in through the air freight at Logan Airport. So that happened, and that became a very dangerous time for me, because when I refused to make that deal, this guy had a understanding with Raymond Patriarca, who is the boss of the whole New England crime family, that he was going to try to take over the soft drug business. Because what happened was, as I said earlier, the money started to become so big there was so much money involved in the marijuana business during the 70s and 80s that the real mob tried to muscle in. And sometimes these gangsters had sons who were involved. So the gangsters tried to move in. And of course, when you're dealing with, the docks or airports and stuff like that, there's organized crime involved. And that's where Whitey Bulger came in, because one of the guys at the airport that I was paying on was an Irish guy who was connected to Whitey. So when the Italians came along and threatened to kill me if I didn't pay them $1 million and start giving them half the load, which I refused to do, then the Irish guy that I knew who worked in air freight was the one who hooked me up with Whitey, and I had a meeting with Whitey, told him the story, and he said, "Don't worry about it. I'll take care of it." And ultimately, he met with them, and it's written about in a couple of books where he because he had more power in Boston than the Italians. Whitey's whole Irish mob was more powerful than the Italians, because nobody even dreamt at that point that he was also working for the FBI. I mean, if I had even thought that, I would have been, no, that's not a possibility. This is the most powerful gangster in New England, and he's also an FBI informant, but he was.
Well, let me ask you this, though, because it's a legitimate expense. If they control that airport, that they deserve to get paid for you using their airport. But why would Bulger get your pass on that?
Well, we were paying.
You were paying. Okay.
Yeah, we paid $30,000 every time.
Okay.
And the guys at the airport were happy with that.
Okay.
They were perfectly happy with it. And after I met with Whitey and told him the deal, he said, "Yeah, just if you want to kick him up a little bit more money." And then he had a load of pot in Boston in South Boston, in a warehouse in South Boston that he needed help selling. So I got my guys, and we sold the load to them. So yeah, there was reciprocal. I mean, they were, the thing about those guys is if you're a good earner, you're making money, they don't want to shut you down. It was just it was a power struggle. Once the Italians found out that I was connected with Whitey and this other guy, this Lebanese guy, they were like, "Oh, well, we didn't want to bother you. We're sorry. We didn't know that you were already paying these guys." So.
What about back to New York? Okay, when you had the Colombo family, the Scarpos. Okay, I guess they were bringing in Thai stick, and they had come into Staten Island. They took over everything on Staten Island very violently. Do you know anything about all that time?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Brett Scarpa and his son Greg Jr.
Right.
They were a perfect example of what I talked about earlier, where you had these old-style mafiosos, and Greg Scarpa Sr. was a captain in the Colombo family, unbeknownst to everybody. He was also an informant for the FBI. But his son, Greg Jr., started opening up these spots, what they call these spots, where they were selling pot. And they tried to basically muscle in with the same kind of operation that the mob was using for other businesses, but it didn't really work in the pot business. It wasn't going to work in the pot business. Pot business has a whole different market. And because of the people who were involved, the people like me and the so-called Hippie Mafia, they had to come to us if they wanted to distribute a large amount of marijuana, because they didn't have the market. They had the market for heroin. They ultimately got the market for cocaine, too. But they didn't have the market for marijuana. And I believe that, well, now, of course, it's virtually legal, but they couldn't control it. And that was the one thing that was the advantage that we had. We controlled, because we built that market. There was no market before. Mostly it was college kids and Vietnam vets returning home. Those were the people, and guys like me, who were bringing it in, who ended up selling it all. I mean, the reason Boston was such a hub of activity was because there were so many colleges up there, and there were people who were financing their college educations by dealing pot.
But they were able to come to Staten Island. They took over the College of Staten Island. They took over Wolf's Pond Park, two major. These were like supermarkets, and they came in and they took over. But now my question is, though, they were bringing in their own product. They were bringing in this Thai stick through containers. They were bringing in that themselves, or were you involved in that?
No, I was not involved in that, and I don't know who was. I mean, the people that I knew who were bringing in Thai sticks were mostly West Coast people.
Okay.
They were bringing it into either to Vancouver or to Seattle and San Francisco. Big loads of Thai sticks and Cambodian pot and Thai pot and Vietnamese pot coming in. A lot of those guys were vets too, were Vietnam vets who didn't spend time in that part of the world. And that pot that comes from that part of the world is actually the indica pot, which is always my favorite. I've always preferred indica pot. I find it much more intellectually stimulating. And
does Thai stick still exist? Do people still get that?
That's a good question, man.
Yeah.
Good question. I don't know.
Now, do you still smoke?
Not so much. You know, they have these vaporizer things now, which help people. But you know, it's like, I mean, my health is important
right.
to me, and you know, I think if you're bringing hot smoke and burning coals into your lungs,
right,
it can definitely. It's not a good thing. So the vaporizer for me is a much better thing. It doesn't have, I don't think, the same amount of physiological damage. But again, it's not something that isn't that important to me anymore. Much more important to me is the getting rid of these ridiculous laws and letting people be free in the United States to alter their consciousness as they see fit, as long as they're not harming anyone else. That, to me, is much more important than my own getting high. You know, I work so much, I write so much that it's not some part of my lifestyle anymore.
Now, you've turned out to be an incredibly creative person with these series. Tell me about the movie White Boys. And how did that come about? Because I love that movie.
Yeah.
I love that movie, man.
Yeah. White Boys came about there was a guy named Danny Hawk. And Danny does these, like, stand-up routines. And he and another guy, Garth, something or other's last name, had written a script, and we made a movie called Slam. Do you remember Slam?
No, I'm gonna have to find it.
Okay, Slam came out in 1998, and it was set in Washington D.C., and it was about a kid from the Southwest, a black kid who was basically selling pot, who gets arrested and gets thrown into the D.C. city jail. But he's a poet. He's a spoken word poet, and he ends up doing these incredible routines while he's in prison. We shot it all in the D.C. city jail. Marion Barry was the mayor in D.C. at that time. I was writing an article about him for the magazine, George Magazine, so we got access to the prison. We used mostly real prison. It's an amazing movie. It won the Grand Jury Prize at Sundance in 1998, and it also won the Camera d'Or at Cannes that year. So it did really well. And after that movie came out, we could get virtually any movie deal we wanted. But we found this script for White Boys, and they brought me in to rewrite it. And I rewrote it with Danny's blessing, and we cast it with these amazing actors. This guy, Dash Myhawk, who's still one of my favorite actors, great actor. Basically young kids. And the whole story behind it was these kids from Iowa, white kids from Iowa, who listened to nothing but black gangster rap, and their idea of becoming success in life was to deal drugs and go to prison and get down with the black experience. So it was a satire of that whole kind of white boys mentality. And, here's these kids in Iowa growing up in the cornfields of Iowa, and they want to go to Chicago and become drug dealers. And, of course, it ends with them, getting arrested, getting into trouble. So that was White Boys. But there was a lot of rapping. And when you saw the movie, we had a lot of real rappers in there. We had some crazy music videos that took place like in cornfields and stuff like that.
There's a scene where he's in prison with Snoop Dogg, and he hits the guard because it was the wrong kind of champagne. And he was serving the wrong champagne in prison. It's a great movie, man.
Snoop Dogg was fantastic, man. He was so good. He was great. When he came up there, he had his trailer with his video games in it and everything. And I remember him saying, well, man, need something to smoke. And I gave him some I think it was Thai pot, actually, that he smoked. And then he became completely convinced. I mean, you take guys like Snoop Dogg and Willie Nelson. Those guys smoke more pot than any human being could ever be imagined smoking. And then look at them; they're still creative. They're still doing their thing, running around, doing their concerts, and the whole idea of the potato, the couch potato, the laid back non-entity who just stays high and does nothing is ridiculous. A lot of people who smoke pot are extremely creative and productive.
Yeah, that Olympic swimmer, and when I was smoking, in my heyday of smoking, I was a marathon runner. I'd go out and run for 3 hours, lift weights all day. Mm-hmm. Now, what about the Mike Tyson movie? What's the deal with that?
The Mike Tyson movie was a woman named Barbara Koppel, who was an Academy Award-winning director of documentaries, got a gig to do a movie about Tyson when Tyson was in trouble for this alleged rape. And she knew nothing about boxing, and a friend of mine actually that I had met in prison was close to her and said, well, you should get Richard to write the treatment and work on the movie, and that's how I ended up getting that job. I wrote the treatment that was ultimately became the foundation for the film, and then she hired me as a line producer. So I was running around, setting up these interviews, interviewing people who were close to Tyson, Customato, who was trainer, and all these guys who were in his world, and I loved it. It was the only thing, and this is shortly after I got out of prison. I probably because I was still on parole. I had to get permission from my parole officer to leave the borough of Manhattan and go upstate to the Catskills where Mike had his training camp. So I loved it because to me it was like it had the same kind of adrenaline rush and the same kind of excitement that smuggling pot had. You're on the phone, you're trying to get people to come here and do this, do that, and they couldn't put you in jail for it. It was creative. It was much more satisfying to me than anything I'd ever done before. So that got me hooked on making documentary films. Then I hooked up with a guy named Mark Levin, who hired me to work on a documentary about about the mob and about these gangsters who were in prison, a lot of whom I knew and had been locked up with. And then I started this magazine called Prison Life Magazine, which was a very successful, critically very successful magazine. Unfortunately, was not a moneymaker because I failed to figure in the fact that, who's going to advertise for magazines basically geared towards prisoners, written by prisoners. But the stuff that we had was fantastic. It won e-reader awards. It was a really well-done magazine. Lasted for 3 years. And out of that, I met with this woman at HBO who loved the magazine, a woman named Sheila Nevins, who wanted to do a series of documentaries about prison life that were presented by Prison Life Magazine and HBO. And we did these 4 documentaries. We did one called Thug Life in D.C., which became the basis for the movie Slam. We did another one called Execution Machine, Texas Death Row, about people getting the death penalty in Texas. And then we did another one called Gladiator Days, which is an amazing film. I mean, probably one of the ones that most people that know my work are blown away by that film. And that was all about these prison guards who were setting prisoners up to fight in prison and then betting on it and stuff like that. It's an unbelievable film. And the other one that we did was, Execution Machine, Prisoners of the War on Drugs, which was all about how much drugs were actually in prison. I mean, I tell a lot of people, I never did heroin until I got I did a little bit, but I never did heroin like I did with that one until I got to prison. There was so much drugs in prison. It was unbelievable how much drugs there are in prison. Which makes sense when you figure, you're locking up a bunch of people who are drug smugglers. They know how to smuggle drugs. And you got a bunch of other people who are drug consumers. So it's a natural place for business to take place.
Now, before you went to
MCC, when we were at MCC here in New York, the Metropolitan Correctional Center, which we call the Criminal Hilton, which is the craziest jail in the world, right here in Manhattan. In fact, I look out my window now and I can see the jail across the way. I spent over 2 years in that jail while they were fighting this whole second prosecution and the appeal I had on the double jeopardy ground. So I spent a lot of time there. And that was unbelievable how much drugs there were in that place. Just incredible. I write about it in my second book called Gulag America that's coming out next year. It's all about the 8 years that I spent in prison.
Now, they say that people that are successful on the outside, they get along well on the outside, they get along well on the inside as well, right? Now, before you went in, did you make advanced preparations? Did you contact people inside and try and make a path for yourself?
No.
Just went in?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't really, I sort of knew that it was going to happen, but once I got arrested, I didn't have any chance. I mean, that was it. They weren't going to, they let me out on bail up in Maine, and I jumped bail. Split. So, I was a fugitive for like 2 years, and then they finally arrested me again out in Los Angeles, and at that point, there was no way they were going to let me out.
Yeah.
They set my bail so high, there was no way I could make it. So I thought, okay, this is it. I'm going to spend a lot of time in these institutions. I better figure out how to do it and, exactly what I want to get out of it. And, for me, it was like a time to reflect on my life, a time to take kind of figuring out what I had done, who I was, take mental inventory and karmic inventory, and I felt good about the fact that I was not going to become a rat and testify against other people, which turned out to be the smartest thing I ever did. And I thought, okay, now I'll have time and I'll write. I'd been a writer before that, and I wrote a novel while I was locked up, which was published in 1990, the year that I got out. So I had a career when I came out of prison as a writer, and, look, the thing about prison is that it's lonely as hell. That's the real punishment. They take you away from the people you love. You're locked up with a bunch of people that you may or may not want to really be around. You have no privacy. You're in these kind of holding pens, or you're in these cell blocks, and there's constant noise. You can't get away from other people. You're out in the yard. You're surrounded by people or guards. So it's a very kind of, you're forced to pull down your pants and bend over and spread your cheeks sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, depending on what's going on. It's a really uncomfortable way to live, but by the same token, you can say, well, okay, I don't have to pay rent. I don't have to have a job. I don't have to have any of the other worries that you worry about outside. You don't even have to worry about girlfriends. If you're straight male, you're doing your time. You keep your focus on what you're doing, and it's a remarkably what's the word I want? You're free of a lot of the normal anxieties that you have in the outside world.
Almost like monastic, like a monastery.
It's like a monastery, exactly.
Let me ask you a question, because we're almost toward the end, and I want to ask you a quick question. I'm sorry to interrupt. But now, do you think that you would have had this incredible creative success if the government had not come in and put a stop to your smuggling? Like, you could have got shot or killed over in Lebanon or something else. What do you think?
Exactly. I mean, going to prison saved my life.
Yeah.
It saved my life. I probably would have been dead if I kept going. I was on some kind of a crazy, self-destructive being, too. That's been one of the issues of my personality, is I have a strong self-destructive streak, which I think I've managed to control through these 8 years in prison, and I came to terms with it. I was a risk taker. I love danger. I love that idea of living on the edge. But if you're living on the edge long enough, ultimately you're going to fall over. You're going to end up dead. And that was really, if I had not been locked up, I would have been killed. There's no question in my mind.
Did you ever run with the bulls in Spain?
No. No, that was one thing I never did. I mean, the kind of...
I did.
Is it?
Yeah, I did, yeah.
You're a better man than me, man. I mean, I thought, if I'm going to do something risky, I'm going to get something out of it. I don't want to get some bull's horn up my ass. It's like, I need to get paid.
Yeah. In fact, I did it around 1987, probably while you were still inside there.
In Pamplona?
Yeah, in Pamplona, Spain. Yep.
Yeah. I lived in Spain for a number of years. I lived in Mallorca, the island of Mallorca. I loved it over there.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Yeah, it is.
Well, what do you got coming up? What do you got planned next? What's next for Richard Stratton?
What's next is I'm doing this documentary series about John Gotti Sr. and John Gotti Jr. and the death of the Mafia as we know it. And I am working on, of course, my second book, Gulag America, which is finished actually now. Just turned it into the publishers. That's coming out next year. That's the whole prison years. And then there's a third volume, which is called In the World, about getting out, getting into the entertainment business, about all the crazy people that I met and the issues that I've had with TV and film over the years. So there's that, and then I'm also working on I'm writing a book called MK Ultra.
Oh, cool!
About the secret testing of LSD by the CIA back in the 1950s, based on an article that I wrote that was published in Spin magazine called Altered States of America. It became the title of a book that I published that came out in 2005 called Altered States of America. So that's about the early years of the CIA, from the Cold War to the Summer of Love.
Richard Stratton, author of Smuggler's Blues, A True Story of the Hippie Mafia. Mr. Stratton, I cannot thank you enough, for coming on the show today. It's been a real joy for me, and I hope that you'll come back anytime you want. How's that?
Well, thank you very much. It's been a joy, too, for me to share all these crazy stories with you.
Thank you so much, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, brother. All right. Bye-bye.
God bless you. Richard Stratton, Smuggler's Blues, A True Story of the Hippie Mafia, man. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, guys, there you have it, man. Richard Stratton. I really love that show. This is one of my favorite shows I've done in a long time. Just brings back a lot of memories. One funny story that I'd like to touch on that I was reminded of when we were talking about Greg Scarpa and the Colombo family when they were muscling into Staten Island. There was this guy, who was involved in the marijuana trade on Staten Island. At those spots, when we were talking about in College of Staten Island and Wolf's Pond Park, and when the Scarpas came in and started beating everybody up and pulling out guns and shooting at people and stuff. And, but I could tell you a million stories about this. But there were some guys on Staten Island that controlled the marijuana business at that time. And through a series of connections or whatever, they were taken to meet the Scarpas and the Colombo family in Brooklyn. To sort of like a get to know each other kind of meeting, right? And the plan was, from the Scarpa side, was they were going to take over this guy's business. But the guy was a little naive, little kind of happy-go-lucky kind of guy. And he had been doing business with these guys in Tennessee. And these guys in Tennessee used to bring up marijuana to Staten Island. And one time they had brought up all this dynamite. They had all this dynamite that you could buy and sell down in Tennessee really easily. And they brought it up to New York thinking, hey, we can sell this to these nutbags up there on Staten Island, which were all my friends. And so the guy, when he was meeting with the Scarpas in Brooklyn, brought some of the dynamite with him. Okay. And he also happened to bring his driver at the time was an NYPD cop, and he had a bunch of cops working for him. So he was up there meeting with these Scarpa guys in Brooklyn, and they were talking about this, and they were talking about that. And just when it was getting down to the point where these Scarpa guys were going to put the muscle on him to shake him down, he says, "Oh, I want to show you something. I got all this dynamite." They're sitting in the back of a car. I think it was a limousine they were sitting in the back of. And he goes, "Look, I got all this dynamite, and I want to sell it. Would you guys be interested in buying this dynamite?" And everyone in the limo turns white-faced, and they say, "No, let's get out of here." And then the story came back later on that the Scarpa guys, these Colombo crime family guys, were so shocked that these guys from Staten Island brought cops with them, first of all, and secondly, brought all this dynamite with them in the car to show them the dynamite, to sell the dynamite, that they totally freaked out and decided that maybe it wasn't a good idea to try and shake these guys down. Just a little story from my the old storybook of the days of Staten Island. So anonymous people. Anyway, I really enjoyed today's show. I've been trying to track down that Norman Mailer story for a long, long time. Guys, I want to thank everybody because the member section situation is going really good. Okay, we're making a lot of progress. Don't forget, we're trying to raise funds to get to California in the next week to start our own documentary film company, just like Mr. Stratton has done here in his footsteps, which would be something, a real honor. Okay, so guys, keep in touch. We got. Oh, by the way, next week on Saturday, I think we're gonna have William Ramsey filling in. Okay, so you know what? Spreaker may not be up. Okay. You know what? Hey, I got to work it out with the guys at PIR and PSN and those guys and all those stations as well. Listen, guys, I'll see you next week. There's going to be a recorded show available on Friday night for sure, and then William Ramsey will be taking over on Saturday. Good night.